We're journeying this Advent through the spirituals, reading a devotional written by Dr. Luke Powery. I hope that you've picked it up and you've found it helpful and hopeful this morning. I'd like to read a prayer that we put on the front of the bulletin, the prayer for the week. I hope that you may take it with you after the service this morning and that it may bless you. Dear Lord, carry me home to your presence in the midst of today's ups and downs. Swing by and touch me with the hope of our eternal home. Amen. If you had 5 minutes with God, what would you ask? That's the question we pondered a few weeks ago with our middle school and high school youth. It's one of my favorite Sundays of the year because they always have wonderful answers to that question. Are there dogs in heaven? Why does God allow terrible things to happen? Is everything in the Bible true? Did it happen exactly that way? Why did God create us? And the most Thanksgiving appropriate, is there food in heaven? That was the one I answered most immediately. There better be, I told them. What pricked me with curiosity was how many of our youth's questions were not about this life, but about the life to come. Really, the sum of their big question was, what is the end like? What is the end like? Maybe you've asked that question before. What will it be in the end? To put it in the language of our current season, what we were talking about was not Advent 1, not the advent of the manger and the shepherds and baby Jesus and the star, but the weirder, scarier, more mysterious Advent 2, the coming of Christ at the end of time, at the end of all things. What will that end be like, I wonder? Well, since you and me probably don't get 5 minutes with God face to face on this side of things, I wonder where we should go to look for our answers. The first place I could think of was in what I would call the flyover books of the Bible, known as the prophetic literature. Like that weird item on a dinner menu that just has a little too much going on, so you're not adventurous enough to order it, the prophetic books aren't exactly those that we gravitate toward. It doesn't help either that the first prophetic book that you come to is the longest, 66 chapters in all. Coincidentally, the same number of chapters as we have total books in our Bible. In our brevity world of Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook, long-winded Isaiah doesn't stand a chance. But beyond their weirdness and length, the third strike against the prophets is that I'm not sure we really know what in the world a prophet is. Is the prophet like Saruman of Lord of the Rings, big bearded man with a long cane, scraggly gray hair, hand over a crystal ball? Is the prophet like Harry Potter, who has premonitions and visions of his enemies' feelings and actions? Is the prophet like Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams, hearing voices in his head? If you build it, they will come. If we don't know what a prophet is, we're going to have a hard time understanding their poetry, what it has to speak into the voids of today. As I tell our confirmands, our 7th and 8th graders who go through learning about the Christian tradition for a year, I tell them every year, the most surefire way to misinterpret a book of the Bible is to mistake what its genre is, the way that it wants to be read. Let me explain. We do this all the time. You don't read a poem the same way that you read a work of nonfiction. You don't read a text message the same you do a letter from a friend. You don't expect to take away the same thing from Frozen 2 that you do from A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood if you went to the movies this holiday. You don't interpret stand-up comedy the same way you do a presidential address, the same way you do a TED Talk, the same way you do a YouTube video. You get the idea. The genre, the form of something determines the way that we read it, the way that we understand and interact with it. When it comes to the prophets, many of us have been doing the reading equivalent of taking a tennis racket up to home plate. We've just brought the wrong tools for the game. The first time it hit me what a prophet is and what a prophet does, I was riding in a bus into Bethlehem alongside the large wall that separates Israel and Palestine. Just as we approached one of the checkpoints, the whole bus sort of gasped at once, because there on the wall to the left of us were two massive murals that had been graffitied onto them. On the first wall, two young boys play with their sticks and shovels and pails around in the dirt, and just above and behind them, you can see through the wall to palm trees and beautiful waters flowing. The second image depicted what seemed to be an angry member of a mob, his face covered, black sweatshirt on, ready to throw something of danger over the wall. But when you look closer, you see that what's in his hand is not a grenade or a Molotov cocktail, but a bouquet of multicolored flowers. I'd lived long enough in Israel to feel its divisions and tensions from both sides. As I gazed at these stunning images, I found myself surprised and confused and delighted, sort of all at the same time. That's what art and images do to us. What I saw was something prophetic, I think. Images that point and gesture toward a future beyond conflict, beyond alienation. I saw murals of hope. The prophet Isaiah does just that. He's a painter. He's like a biblical painter who paints pictures of God's future, of God's hopes on all of the walls of today. The prophet Isaiah is less a foreteller who's having premonitions about the future than he is a forth-teller. Telling things, calling things, beckoning things forth into now. We come to the prophet Isaiah asking to know exactly what the end looks like, but he reframes our question altogether. Like Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, modern prophets, the prophet looks at our broken world and surprises us with images of a hopeful future, with the possibility of something different. If we had 5 minutes with old Isaiah and said, "Hey, Isaiah, what is the end like?" This is what he would say, and this is our scripture reading for today. "In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between nations, shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This last July, Laura and I got a permit to hike Yosemite Valley's most famous icon, Half Dome, though part of the way up the mountain I thought you would have to have half a brain to agree to do it. 8.5 miles, 4,000 feet, 2 waterfalls, 3 brown bears, and 1 very sketchy 500-foot cable climb later, we had made it to the top of the mountain. After my heart had stopped beating out of my chest from the fear of the climb that I had experienced, we had a moment where we sat on a rock. sat in silent, breathless reverence, gazing out at the cathedral of God's painting, God's artistry, God's created world. I remember thinking, there's just something about mountains. Even in the midst of all the chaos of the world down below in the valley, I had this feeling like new horizons, new futures are possible. Not a day has passed since I've thought about the image that I saw atop that mountain. When we came down, we luckily stumbled upon a pizza place. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about that pizza either. As I stood in line, the person next to me must have seen from the dogged deer caught in the headlights look on my face that I had just ascended Half Dome, and she said, "Was it what you expected?" "Not at all," I responded. "It was beyond anything I could have ever imagined." But the people of Isaiah's day, they were not yet on the mountaintop. They had not yet made it up there. No, they were on the valley floor. Isaiah looked out at the people he loved, the world that he loved, and he saw walls that divided the people more than ever before. The politics of the 7th century had splintered society in two, with the northern kingdom of Israel split from the southern kingdom of Judah. In-groups formed, fear about the future spread like a disease. People stopped listening to one another altogether, stopped paying attention to their neighbors. Allegiances hardened, tribes formed. While both sides fought and debated, the world suffered. The gap between the poor and the rich grew. People went hungry and thirsty in the streets. People forgot the mandate to take care of God's created world. Mindless violence filled the cities. Cynicism became the common speech of the people, and despair its resting pulse. The Bible may be old, but sometimes it can sound really familiar. While the world of Isaiah erects all these walls of division and disintegration, Isaiah gets up on the mountaintop and sees things from God's point of view, a vision of a different kind of future, a new horizon that could be possible for his people. And so he starts to paint. On the wall of polarization, Isaiah paints a mural where all nations are walking together, hand in hand, singing a hymn endlessly. Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord together as one people. On the wall of separation and violence and strife, Isaiah paints a mural where our weapons are turned into farming tools. Did you notice that? Swords to plowshares, spears to pruning hooks. Is it possible, dreams Isaiah, that the very things that pull us apart could be transformed into seeds of a bright and new future? Is it possible? On the wall of self-centeredness and loneliness, Isaiah paints a mural where God is not far away from us. God, in the end, does not sit up on an almighty throne in the clouds looking down at us. Rather, God comes down into the midst of the people. God comes down to the mountain with all of us. Now, maybe you hear Isaiah's dream and you think that sounds like some grand utopian vision of a perfect future. And some may hear it and think that we can just sit around and wait for God to make it happen. In the meantime, bide our time. But Isaiah reminds us that in order to get to the mountaintop together, God must first teach us his ways, that we must walk in his paths. If we want a glimpse of God's future to enter into our existence, Isaiah says we must learn the kind of hope that takes place as a way of walking. Of all the images of the end, Isaiah imagines that we walk together up a mountain. This hopeful walk up the mountain is not the same thing, I don't think, as optimism. Optimism assumes that everything will be all right in the end, but you can think optimistically without doing anything. Hope is different. It's seeing the brokenness. It's seeing the division and strife. It's seeing that people are hurting, and nevertheless, even so, as the hymn said, living out God's hopeful future now in small, little, itty-bitty, concrete ways. Because if we know how the story ends, then we can begin to live it now. Live God's future now. As Andy Dufresne says at the end of Shawshank Redemption, hope is a good thing, maybe even the best of things, because no good thing ever dies. Hope is not an idea. It's not merely an emotion. It's a way of life. It's a walk. It's an active attitude, a participation in this world. It is a deliberate choice to wake up in the morning and to live out God's world now. So many of us have been tricked into thinking that the point of Christianity and Advent is that if we just live good enough for long enough, we might have a shot at making it up to heaven in the end. But that's not hope. Hope is letting God use us to start painting murals on all of the drab and dying and dilapidated walls our world has erected before us. There is a future that is possible with God. Hope is believing that this future world could be here now, as Jesus taught us to pray, on earth as it is in heaven. I wonder, if we started to believe in this kind of hope, what swords that cut apart and disintegrate Salisbury could be transformed into plowshares, farming tools that will sow the seeds of a better tomorrow? What if people started talking about First Presbyterian Church and they said, that church, they have their hang-ups, but they sure do hope. They sure do hope. Last Thursday, I saw a mural of hope painted before my very eyes in the fellowship hall. I was invited with Laura to attend a dinner that our own Discovery class has been having for 4 years now with African American members of the Crown and Glory Church just down the street. In our divided times, a small group of people decided it was just time to get to know one another as human beings. And what I saw was glimmers of active hope. Black folks and white folks eating a meal together, praying together, laughing and joking together, talking together about what future God might have for this city in this complex time in which we live. I saw people join hands and start the trek up the mountain. You know, I'm not sure what the end will be like. I'm not sure what God has for us in the end, but I do know that when we finally get our 5 minutes with God, I hope that He asks us, was it what you expected? No, not at all. It was beyond anything I could have ever imagined.